Hello and welcome to Inside Exercise. Today I'm really pleased to say that we've got Louise Burke with us, sports dietitian extraordinaire, probably the best track record in sports nutrition. She talks to us about how she got into the field, high carbohydrate diets versus the more sort of high fat diets, high ketogenic sort of diets that people are into more recently, about how it's hard to compete with the social media influencers to get our message out. The importance of individualizing nutrition, glycogen synthesis after exercise, ingestion of carbohydrate during exercise, whether the electrolyte balance of the drink is important or not, protein, and whether we should really be so worried about having enormous amounts of protein. And with the Tour de France on at the moment, we spoke a little bit about the dietary practices of Tour de France cyclists. So enjoy it. Hi, Louise. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Thanks for coming along. It's great to have you on. Most people would know you as a dietitian that's done all sorts of research, PhD in exercise physiology, so just a huge name in the area. I'm just wondering, how did you get into the area originally?
Completely by accident. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I left school. Didn't get a lot of good careers advice in high school and ended up pulling out of doing medicine because I just couldn't see myself as a doctor and I didn't want to take a position away from somebody else who did. And so I started a science degree and there were some subjects in nutrition and I didn't even know there was such a thing as a dietitian or that you could have a career about nutrition, but it appealed to me. And so I was happily doing that, going along a conveyor belt that I'd end up as a dietitian without sort of really thinking about it. And then one day, because it was a small class, our chief lecturer, Richard Reed, was a really kind man and he invited all the students home and for dinner. And so we were all eating his wife's lovely cooking and I noticed his plate was just lettuce and cheese. And I had to inquire why would he not make, use of the good food? And he said, I'm doing a marathon on the weekend. And these Scandinavians have just published a paper and it shows that if you deplete glycogen at the beginning of the week and then carbo load, you can super compensate and you won't hit the wall. And I mean, of course, my big passion was always sport. And so as soon as he said that, the light bulbs just went off in my mind and that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to make a career out of this, but there wasn't a pathway to be following. So I bullied Richard into letting me drop microbiology and to do a subject with him, which was just sort of personal learning and picking his brain. And then after I finished dietetics, I started a PhD with him again because, he was the conduit to understanding all this work. And then I got myself over to ACSM and found that, it was an established science, if not a pathway for a career. And I just sort of made it up after that. And everything I've done has just been absolute accident. You send letters to the AIS saying, why haven't you got a nutrition department? You write to the St Kilda Football Club and say, you've only won one premiership in 125 years. It's probably because you're not eating right, And sometimes those letters turn into something, others they don't. But suddenly I'm here and, you look back, I think, if you're listening to some young people are listening to here, sometimes you think you can't get where you want or it's not happening fast enough. But when you get to the end of your career, you look back and you think everything contributed, everything now makes sense. It all was a organised, logical pathway, even though it didn't seem at the time to be what you wanted. But
wow, that's great.
Complete accident.
Well, actually, but then again, the thing they say, you make your own luck or whatever. So complete accident in some ways, but you obviously made your own luck. You did well enough to get into medicine. And then you actually, who writes to St Kilda Club and says, you need a dietitian, or the AIS, you need a dietitian. So you made your own luck,
But look, I also had incredible generosity along the way because, that letter at St Kilda went to Trevor Barker and you think about how many girls would have been writing letters to Trevor Barker in those days. He would have got thousands of letters every week. And he read mine and he gave it to the club doctor who rang me and said, why don't it come down?
Okay.
So, I mean, how incredibly generous is that? And so I think a lot of my life might be accident, but a lot of it's been made possible by people who took a punt and were very nurturing and generous to someone who was clearly out of their depth.
To you. That's probably the reality of it. They took a shine to you. If you were obnoxious or something, it probably wouldn't have happened. And what, to bring it back to the, okay, so let's think about the research. So what about, so the initial thing about, you know, eat less carbs and then eat lots and whatever. Why don't you talk about that a little bit to people? Is, you know, that's borne out.
Yeah, so look, again, as an accident, I'm now a full-time researcher, but up until recently, I was a practitioner who did research as a hobby, because it was always important to me to have an evidence base to what we were telling athletes to do. And lots of my research has been started by listening to a story that athletes are talking about or something that's being proposed to them. And it's really following the application of that idea into performance improvements. So yes, you know, I've learned biochemistry and I've learned, you know, some heavy duty science, but it was part of a conduit to get me to helping athletes perform better. And along the way, and look, I've been a dietitian for 40 years now. And so being that old means that you've seen things come in cycles many times. You know, in the 80s, when I was first reading those papers with Richard Reed, one of the things that we read about was a study of the ketogenic diet and how it might help cyclists be able to cycle for longer because they weren't going to run out of the glycogen, because they could now use fat as their major fuel source. So that was the 80s. And then in the 90s, we did a whole series of studies on the high-fat diet and moved on to the high-fat diet and trying to integrate it with then restoring carbohydrates so that you might have the best of both worlds. And in both those occasions, you know, the ideas were looked at and they died because they didn't work. And so then in 2012, we start getting the keto diet back again. And this time it's got social media behind it. And you can't be a snob and say...
Step back a bit, make sure everyone's on the same page, yes? So, you know, you and I and a lot of other people have always thought, well, you need carbohydrates. So that was the original thing you talked about, right? When you were out to dinner, to have carbohydrate loading, to have a lot of carbohydrate on board so you can have glycogen in your muscles and your liver. And during, you know, exercise that's got any sort of decent intensity, you mainly, you know, you really need carbohydrates. You're burning some fat, mainly carbohydrate, right?
Yeah.
But then there's ideas that people come along, well, let's do high fat because then you can spare your carbohydrates and it'll last longer. Let's do ketones and spare. So just to bring people up to date. So as you said, you did the studies in the late 1990s saying, okay, well, let's put them on a high fat diet and then high carbs at the end. And then what did you find?
We found no improvement in performance. We found that it enabled the muscle to be retooled. It could double the amount of fat that it was burning as a fuel source during exercise. And this was in people who were already well trained, so they were even better at burning fat than the average punter. And we could double it, but it still didn't improve performance. And we could not work out why, because we're thinking, you know, you've got all this glycogen sparing, and when we get to the end of the race, surely that was going to turn into better fuel, better performance. And it was not until we then hooked up with Trent Stellingworth, who was doing his PhD with Lawrence Spreet, we sent him some of our muscle, and we had taken biopsies and looked at the fat pathways, and we'd seen upregulation of fat transport and fat uptake and fat enzymes, but we got Lawrence to have a look at the other side of the story, and that's what was happening to carbohydrate. And we found that there was a complete downregulation of your carbohydrate pathways. So even though all that lovely glycogen was there and it was being used more slowly, we thought that was a good thing because it was being spared till you needed it. But then we found that what was actually happening, it was being impaired in its utilization. The enzymes that break down glycogen were downregulated, but most importantly, the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase, which commits the pyruvate from glycogen into the TCA cycle and produces ATP, was downregulated. So there's your major fuel pathway, and suddenly it's not working as well. So that explained why, even though you had this benefit of being able to burn fat, when you want to get into the higher intensity parts of your race, or whether you're doing a race that's all higher intensity, if you're doing a 2-hour marathon, you're not burning much fat in that one. But you know, the reason why it couldn't convert to better performance is that your gear that's most important for critical success was impaired. So we stopped doing it back, you know, in 2000 when we got to that point, realizing, well, you know, it might be okay for athletes who just want to tootle along in sports where it's all low intensity and, you know, they're not needing that gear. But when I work with Olympic athletes, I'm dealing with a different kind of a sport. So it's not going to be important for my athletes.
Exactly. So to tie that up there. So you basically you've taught the body to use fat, right? Which makes sense. So then when you go and try and use carbohydrate, you've just told us, you know, so in your study, 5 or 6 days of high fat. So the body adapts to burning fat. And then you do your sub-maximum, but great, it's burning more fat, sparing glycogen, fantastic. But then when they try and do, so you did time trials, and they had to up the pace, and they couldn't do as well because you've got to burn more carbohydrate. And it's like, dude, you just taught me how to burn fat, and now you're expecting me to burn carbohydrate.
It wasn't until we then moved to the most recent version of our work, looking at the ketogenic diet, which is even more carbohydrate restricted. But again, it was being proposed to athletes as a way of burning more fat. And this time when we did it, I was a bit more careful with the way that we did our measurements. We did our studies at the AIS this time, and there's a bespoke metabolic cart which is able to measure the utilisation of substrates and the respiratory gases more precisely than your normal commercial carts. And when we had that ability to look more closely at things, I was looking at the numbers and thinking, this is funny. When the athletes are now burning more fat, and this time we'd moved to world-class athletes, we'd moved to elite race walkers, you know, people who've won gold medals at world championships and the Olympic Games. So when we're looking at those athletes, they're even more special. And we still saw this impairment of performance with the movement to the high-fat diet. And this time I looked at the data and I thought, that's funny. They're now having to use more oxygen to burn that fat. And I remember talking to Ron Morn about it, and he looked at me as if I was stupid, which I was. And he said, of course, Louise, you know, from 100 years ago, Crow could measure that if you're burning fat, you're going to require, you know, 5 to 8% more oxygen to produce the same amount of ATP. And so suddenly we had the next piece of the puzzle, which was why being reliant on fat isn't useful. Because even though you might say, well, you've downregulated the pathways, the problem with leaving then fat as your only pathway is it requires more oxygen. Now, if you're doing a race at 60% of VO2 max, then moving it up to 65% of VO2 max isn't a problem. But if you're doing races where the critical part or the whole race, if you're Eliud Kipchoge, is done at 85, 90% of VO2 max, well, you haven't got an ability to move in that direction. And, you know, sometimes I have to explain to people again in a way that they're familiar with what this concept is and how important it is, because in track and field over the last 5 years, every world record for men and women from 5,000 metres to 100 kilometres has been broken. And it's been attributed to the super shoes. What do the super shoes do? They lower the oxygen cost of movement by about 4%. And so it's changed sport. Why would you think that reducing your economy, making it need 4% more oxygen to do the same work, wouldn't be a problem? And so when you think of it like that, I think it's pretty convincing to say the ketogenic diet might have some usefulness in some sports and for some other reasons, but if it's for sports performance, working at those higher intensity endurance sports, well, then it's a no-go.
That's perfect, because it brings together, you know, I had Andy Jones on just last week, and he was talking about what does it take to break a 2-hour marathon. And that was exactly right. You need the VO2 max, you need what percent of VO2 max you can hold, or like the lactate threshold, and then the running economy. And that was the whole point. We were talking about the shoes. And so that's a very important point, that, you know, even if you are doing, burning more fat during the sub-maximum exercise, when you try and up the pace, you need to be more economical, not less. So that ketone diet is going the opposite direction in various ways.
And the other thing about it people have criticised us for is we didn't go long enough. We should have gone long enough. And I'm thinking, well, hang on, we're dealing with biochemical pathways here. How long do you think you have to go to completely change a biochemical pathway? It's not possible.
Yeah, exactly. Those first studies you did, I thought about that myself. I think that you did the 6 days with the high carb or the high fat, and then the last day you did high carb and the glycogens went up and they burnt more fat, but then the performance wasn't as good during the time trial. But I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe you just got to go longer. Maybe you got to go longer. And I think, you or others did like 100K in the end, right? And it still wasn't better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it disappoints a lot of the people that really believe in it, especially those on social media. But look, at some point you just have to say, well, look, I'm not ever going to say black or white things don't work or do work. It's about applying them in the right context. And so, as I said before, the context I work with is elite athletes who need to have a high gear. They need to be able to be economical and move at very high speeds, which are at very high percentages of their VO2 max. And so it doesn't make sense to use a less efficient fuel. But, there are other options and other sports in which it may not be a problem. And so I'm quite happy to live in a world where we can all have different ideas. But, for me, it's not part of the toolbox that I'm happy to use.
The hard part is that more and more people nowadays get their information from social media and influencers and things like that. How do we get this information out there? Because I just talk to people all over the place, and they say, oh, you need really high protein, you need really high fat, and carbohydrate just seems to not get much of a mention. People think that's just not sexy or something.
Well, look, things come in cycles. So maybe, the next thing will be carbs, the best thing since sliced bread. And, there'll be this new wave. But you're right about the influences because, you and I can talk on this podcast and I can write a paper, but how many people will read that? Kim Kardashian's got, how many million followers, and she's not even the most popular in her own family. So it's crazy when you think about, we've got, Kylie Jenner with more than that. So, it's amazing when you think about how you're trying to move information and just how much other noise there is out there from people who take up most of the atmosphere.
Well, even last night I was watching the Tour de France, and Simon Gerrans is on there. So this Australian professional cyclist who's now retired, and he kept talking about carbs, this, carbs, that. So there's all these questions from the audience, and it was like, how much do they have, what do they eat during the stages, and what do they have after the stages, and how many calories do they go through in a day, and whatever. And everything he was saying was, you need carbohydrate, you need carbohydrate. And these guys are riding for 5 or 6 hours, and I just wish it would get through people's heads. He's not saying, have ketones and high fat diets and whatever.
Well, one of the interesting things, though, that it's good to get across is that in sport now there is, even in athletes who are doing sports that are based on carbs, it's not black and white. I mean, we now, rather than thinking that every athlete has a high carbohydrate diet every day of their life, we now periodize things. So there'll be periods when Simon as a cyclist or other cyclists out there are quite happy and deliberately have restriction of carbohydrate to send some special sessions of exercise with extra power to adapt. So, training with low glycogen means the quality of the training session is reduced, but some of the processes of adaptation to that session are increased. And so, we now work with athletes to change carbohydrate intake day by day in the different phases of the training program. So those people who think that all that dietitians do is bang on about eating carbohydrates really don't understand what modern sports nutrition is about.
That's perfect, yeah, because for a while there was always like, oh, you need to have 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram per day, day in, day out. I remember testing a triathlete at one stage, and I worked out he was getting 25% of his energy from sports drinks, because he was having sports drinks, before exercise, sports drinks during exercise, sports drinks after exercise, because he wanted to get his glycogen back up. And this, so it's the other thing I've picked up here and there and mentioned to people is you don't necessarily have to have massive amounts of carbohydrate the whole time. If you're exercising twice a day, then maybe you want to get your glycogen back, but most people, sure, if you're talking about elite athletes, they're exercising like once a day. My feeling is you don't actually need to have massive amounts of carbohydrate to get the resynthesis by the next day. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've written a paper for International Journal of Sport Nutrition trying to explain all the different terms around the way that athletes do periodize carbs, that they can train low on some occasions, they can recover low on other occasions, then they want to train high. It's all about understanding what the purpose of the training session was about and what nutrition strategy can you attach to that to amplify the response. And so it's very much about, high, medium and low, depending on the session. And then for the rest of the day, sort of amplifying that again. So exactly. Sports nutrition has got lots of tricks up its sleeve. It's not just the black and white people think.
The other thing was, so remember you were doing your PhD with Mark Hargreaves was your co-supervisor, is that right?
No, I did my PhD with Richard Reed, and then it was after that. I was lucky to have Richard's input, but Deakin didn't have a laboratory for me to learn anything in. And so I was introduced to Mark by Dave Costel, and I approached Dave Costel at a conference. And again, this generosity thing, he was probably wanting to talk to some other people, and I was trying to, get an idea of what I could do. And he said, look, I'm going to tell you, there's this guy coming back to Australia he's just been in my lab. His name's Mark Hargreaves, and he's a great guy. And so I rang Mark and I took him out to lunch. I remember having lunch in Footscray. We went to some sandwich shop and I bought him a sandwich. So it was a big investment. And again, I bullied him into letting me come and do some stuff in the lab. And he was terribly generous with allowing me to come out to VUT, or Footscray Institute of Technologies it was at the time, and to have a lab experience. And so we went on to do lots of studies together, where his generosity in teaching me things and helping me to think through things a bit with more sophistication and complexity really helped my career.
I never put that together because I remember seeing you there when I was doing my PhD with Mark Hargreaves, and it was the same thing. David Costel, because I did my master's with him, he said, why don't you go and work with either Mark Hargreaves or John Sutton? And I contacted both of them, ended up going with Mark. So I saw you there. So I was thinking he was your co-supervisor or something. But yeah, my point there was, as part of my PhD, was we were trying to look at low glycogen versus high glycogen, and then its effect on glucose uptake during exercise. And we couldn't for the life of us get low glycogen. We'd deplete them and then put them 48 hours on a 25% carbohydrate diet, then bring them in and their glycogen would be normal. So then the only way we'd get it low was to deplete them the night before with exercise, and even like arm cranking. So cycling and then arm cranking to like get it all out, and then put them on 7%, bring them back carbohydrate, bring them back in the next day, and it would be low-ish, not low. So anyway, my point there was, we find it hard to get people to have their glycogen low. So that was my point earlier. Like if you have a normal diet and you're exercising like once a day, my feeling is you end up with pretty much normal glycogen, that you don't have to have like amounts.
Yeah, the other thing people don't realise, it is such an important fuel that your body has different ways in which you can manufacture it. So it's not just relying on the carbohydrate that you're consuming. It's got pathways that it can make glycogen from other metabolites that it has kicking around. And so that's, showing, I guess, from an evolutionary perspective, how important it is to have some muscle glycogen. And, it's sort of, again, when people talk about, fats and carbohydrates in the diet, they're not really thinking about, from an evolutionary advantage, what's important for our body to be able to do. It's certainly more efficient to be able to store glycogen by eating carbohydrate, but there are other ways to be able to store it.
Right. Yeah, so what I was thinking is, a lot of people sort of think, I'm going to have this and that, carbs, I'm going to drink sports drinks and whatever. But, you've been talking about elite athletes and things like that. For the average punter, it's going to the gym, a few days a week, even like a recreationally, someone is training for running or cycling, but not, elite, they're not competitive, they're not racing, twice a day or whatever. My feeling is they don't really have to worry about sports drinks or carbohydrate loading or whatever. My feeling is they need to just have a normal mixed sort of diet and they'll be fine, rather than all this, fixating on got to have this, got to have that. What do you think of that?
Yeah, look, I think there's plenty of carbohydrate-rich foods that we can rely on for the basic needs. And, one of the things that we should be doing is letting people know that some of the bad reputation around carbohydrates it's well earned, because people are choosing the very low energy density, very ultra-processed forms. And that if we could get people using more of the carbohydrate-rich sources that have plenty of good nutritional value and are minimally processed, then they're going to get much better health advantages from that. The time for using ultra-processed foods or the more specialised sports foods there's two, and they should be just a small proportion of what you're doing. But one is in those practical situations where you do need carbs and it's not practical to eat everyday foods. And so sports drinks have really been manufactured for people to consume during exercise when it's inconvenient to have a bowl of pasta, both from the practical point of view and also from the gut tolerance point of view. But, having a sports drink as a lunchtime drink, or, some sort of way in which you think you're doing yourself a favour outside sport, that's really abusing the purposes. And the other time I think it's, good to be able to have some of the ultra-processed sugary foods is for the enjoyment factor. I mean, I'm well known for loving chocolate. And so I'm quite happy to consume some small proportion of my daily calorie intake with something I really love. And that's because I don't have it in other forms. I'm not loading up on other sugary foods and not really enjoying them, just having them because they're there. So go for the practicality or go for the enjoyment and make it a small but important contribution to your everyday diet.
I'm extremely famous for chocolate. I was eating a family block a day at one stage. I'm not done off that. It was crazy. But funnily enough, I don't know if some people know, some people don't, but your husband is John Hawley, and he's a big name in exercise as well, and research. And I couldn't help thinking when you're saying about having some sugar yourself, I was thinking of John Hawley, how he'd drink Coke, a can of Coke, but he said he'd only do it while he was riding.
Exactly. So that's another good point. He loves the enjoyment of it, but he loves the utility of it in enhancing his exercise. And he's interesting because he says he's been doing this for 40 years, long before we did the study to show that very small amounts of caffeine enhanced performance, not these great amounts that had been previously used as the standard caffeine protocol. And he also invented the slushy. So he's been putting his bottles of Coke in the Neg 80 fridge before he rides at lunchtime. And so he was having it in a slushy form so that he was not just getting the carbs, the caffeine, he was also cooling himself. And so all that work we did with the internal cooling with the slushies before the Beijing Olympics, he'd already discovered that many years before. So I'm lucky to be living with a genius. But he should have told me about it before I had to do the studies.
You know what upsets me? When I was a kid, I invented the frozen Coke. When I was a kid, I used to get Coke and put it like a paddle pop stick.
Yeah.
So I put it in the freezer when I was like 12, and I've just turned 60. So McDonald's brought that out much later.
Oh my goodness.
Hey, so that's interesting. I didn't know about the caffeine. I knew about caffeine having ergogenic effects, and they're looking at like 4 milligrams per kilogram and 8 milligrams per kilogram and things like that. I didn't realize. So you've gone on now and shown you don't need those sort of high levels?
Yeah, and look, it was one of those examples that so often happen in sport, where athletes and coaches have discovered things well before you. And we were doing quite a bit of work with caffeine, giving these 6 milligram per kg doses. And I remember Dave Martin coming back from a cycling race saying, "You're not going to believe this." He said, "But I was in the feed zone 2/3 of the way in the race, and all the Swannies stopped giving out the sports drink to the athletes. They switched to flat Coke." He said, "Can you imagine that? What sort of marketing? They must be great marketers, Coke, because there's hundreds of studies and there's all this money that's been spent researching sport drinks, and they're switching to Coke." And I said, "How crazy is that? Look, for example, it's probably only got about 1 milligram, maybe 1.5 milligrams of caffeine per kg body mass. So it's nowhere near an effective dose. And they're having it towards the end of the race, not an hour beforehand, like we all know you should do. How stupid are they? So we did the study to show that, and we compared having the standard dose of caffeine an hour before the race with switching to the Coke in the late part of the race. And behold, the time trial performance at the end of both those trials was identical. And so we were one of the early groups to show that low amounts of caffeine, particularly just at the onset of fatigue, are really effective, and started to think more about how caffeine works. It does lots of things in the body, and its most important things in sports performance aren't the free fatty acid rises and these small changes in substrate use. It's the fact that it masks fatigue. And the other really ironic thing about the whole thing, and I've said this to Lawrence Sprett the other day, you know, you were doing all those studies where you're giving 6 to 9 milligrams of caffeine to your athletes, or, you know, your subjects when they're coming into the lab to do the studies. I said, what did you do? You didn't get up and have 10 cups of coffee and say, that's it for the day. No, you probably had a drive-through on the Tim Hortons on the way to the lab. But over the course of the day when you're doing that study, when you got a bit tired, you probably had another cup of coffee just to get back doing what you were able to do. And then you had a bit more when you were crunching the data later that night. And if you had some reports to write, you probably had, you know, one before bed. You used coffee to allow you to keep doing what you were doing just for a bit longer before you fatigued. And you knew that as soon as you sat down and had that cup, you would feel immediately better. It didn't take an hour to have an effect. So you knew all this stuff from your everyday life, but you just didn't apply it to sport.
I've got a really good example of that. I did this thing, Tour de Timor. So in East Timor, 10 years after they got independence, they had this thing, they're trying to get tourists and whatever. They had this Tour de Timor. They let all these fat Western people go. Like, you didn't have to be fit or anything. And I remember the Timorese people were just like all excited to see these athletes, and there was just all sorts of people. But anyway, I came straight from Melbourne to East Timor. It was like 33 degrees. No, it was 30. It was like basically 100 degrees Fahrenheit, like 37 or something like that Celsius, and just crazy humidity. I hadn't acclimated at all. I literally, and it was just straight up these mountains, and you couldn't even use a road bike. You had to use a mountain bike, even though it was a road race, because there was so many potholes and things. And anyway, I was just dying. I literally, this is embarrassing. I like lay in the middle of the road. People were going around me, and I saw this little person selling like water and drinks and whatever on the side of the road. And they'd run out of water because everyone had been buying water. It was so hot. And all they had was cans of Coke. I was like, oh, crap. And I just had to have something. And I drank it, and I just, boom. It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. So, yeah.
And Frank Shorter used it in the marathon in 1972 to win his gold medal. And so this is interesting. Like, isn't it funny how things can be in plain sight? Athletes know about it, and you know about it in your own life from your own experiences. And yet you still do the studies in the traditional way.
Tunnel vision or something.
Yeah.
You kind of think, oh, you're too close to the science, and you think the athletes are stupid, or like you said before. Okay. Because, I mean, it makes sense. That'd be trial and error. They'll be saying, oh, I tried this and it worked. And, you know, like me and my East Timor thing, I didn't know what was going on, but it worked.
You know, everything that athletes do is the right thing. I mean, there's plenty of cases where they're doing crazy stuff and it doesn't work. But, you know, every now and again, there's this absolute kernel of truth that they've discovered before you. And look, you know, going back to what we said before about the periodization of carbohydrate in your diet, when we started doing some work on that, it's sort of in the early 2000s, I remember speaking at a conference and an IOC conference and talking about that. And then that night, John and I were sitting at the table, and we happened to have Frank Shorter on our table. And Frank's a very smart guy. He's a lawyer. And he leaned across to John and he said, you know, that work you're showing about the carbs, you know, doing a session of exercise, depleting, and then doing a second session in the day. He said, I was doing that in 1968. He said, we always ran 20 miles in the morning on Sundays, and then you had to do the 3-miler in the afternoon. And he said, you know, we know all these things. We did all these things. All you scientists are doing is explaining why it was so important.
That's right. I think David Costa had mentioned, I think maybe it was Frank Shorter. He was saying someone, so David Costa from Ball State, he did all these studies on athletes, including Derek Clayton from Australia, who ran the world record or the world best in 1969. And it wasn't broken until 1981 by Alberto Salazar.
Yeah.
He was saying, I think it was Frank Shorter, he said he'd get up and he had like a tiny bit to eat in the morning because he looked at his diet and he thought, this can't be right. Because he had, I think he said he had candy floss or something, like something hardly anything in the morning, did a long run, something again, tiny bit in the afternoon, did a long run, and then he ate like 5,000 calories or whatever at dinner time. He thought he was mad.
Yeah. But now we know why he did it.
Now we know why he did it. Okay, the other thing was, we're talking about, how much carbohydrate should you have, 8 grams and whatever. And then you said, it depends and whatever. Is it the same with carbohydrate ingestion? So for a while there was like, oh, you should have 1 gram per minute, so 60 grams per hour. I guess it depends on the temperature of the day, the athlete, the distance, but what are you thinking around that now? Is that?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of context that needs to go into that. Part of it's the fuel cost of what you're doing and how important that carbohydrate you're consuming during exercise is going to be in contributing to the muscle fuel. If it's got plenty of glycogen, obviously it's going to have a smaller role than if you've started to get low on glycogen stores and need to be more reliant on that form coming in while you're exercising. It's also about what you can tolerate. And so one of the things we now know is that you can train your gut to be better able at being comfortable with consuming carbs, but also to absorb it in the small intestine, that you can upregulate some of the transporters that take the glucose across the border into the bloodstream, and that you do that by having practice in training sessions to do this, what we call gut training. So it's about the amount that you can consume, but even the form. So studies have shown that you can consume glucose during exercise and improve the degree to which you can absorb it and feel comfortable with it. But it's even more specific to the type of carbohydrate that you consumed, whether it's liquid or solid, what form the carbohydrates are coming in. We also suggest if you're doing an event that needs lots of carbohydrate coming in, that you might consume a mixture of carbohydrate sources as your beverage during the event, so that you can have both glucose being transported and fructose being transported by different mechanisms to end up with more carbohydrate being provided. Now, that's really then thinking about how much carbohydrate do you need. And so people who are doing shorter events or who are doing events at lower intensities don't need to be having the 90 grams an hour that the Tour de France cyclist has, because their fuel requirements just are much lower. So it's a bit about understanding what your event might require, understanding you as an individual, because there is a range of tolerance. Even people who do gut training often find that they may be a lower tolerant person versus other people who can get up to 120 grams an hour and still be able to absorb that and to have it feel comfortable. So it's taking your race, taking your individual personal characteristics and trying to put them together to get the best outcome.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because in all the studies we did, we'd find that glucose doesn't really drop until about an hour of exercise. So, there's a bit of a thing about, do you have to drink carbohydrate no matter what you do? So some people, they go to the gym, they're only there for 45 minutes, an hour, and they're cranking on their sports drink. I would suggest that, anything under an hour or so, it's probably not going to make much difference. Would you agree with that?
Well, it also depends on why you're exercising. I mean, if you're exercising to lose weight and to burn calories, well, it doesn't make much sense to be consuming lots of calories during the event during the training session to sort of cancel it out. But one of the things that we're now more aware of is how the brain gets a message as well as the muscle getting the fuel advantage. And we now know that when you put carbohydrate in your mouth, you don't even have to swallow it, that there are receptors in your mouth and throat that send messages to your brain saying, whoa, this is going to be good, you'll feel better. And so part of the reason that athletes consume carbs during some events can be just to keep their pacing, keep their comfort, keep their sort of perception of effort as best as possible. And the thing about that tactic is that it's repeatable. So if there's an event where you can have small amounts of carbohydrates spread out rather than having it all in one hit, then you may get better advantage from both. You get the fuel, but you're able to also get your brain saying, wow, every time you have it. So in the old days, when I run a marathon, I used to just get something at the aid stations, every 5K apart. But these days I carry my own little lollies with my event so that I can have them every 5 minutes and sort of get this continual hit. Your brain's a bit like Homer Simpson. It gets a surprise every time it sees the donuts.
That's a funny one. That's a funny one thinking about Homer Simpson, of course, but that's a funny one thinking about the mouth swirling stuff. So, there's studies where you put the carbohydrate in your mouth, you swirl it around, you spit it out. And you can see the performance improving in that situation as well. So like you said, but if the body's going, oh, I'm getting carbohydrate, and then you spit it out, can you actually end up getting a hypo? Like, does it release more insulin?
Well, I don't think you get the hypo. I just think you overpace. You feel better than you have the fuel stores to do. So, we say to athletes, those experiments that were done where people spat the carbohydrate out, that was just to prove that it hadn't become a fuel source. It's not the best way to get that effect.
No, you wouldn't suggest to do it.
No, and look, it's funny. You see, but I remember seeing the last World Cup in soccer. You'd see the soccer guys, the players having the drink brought out to them, they'd swill it and spit it out. And I'd be thinking, hang on, this game will go to overtime and then penalty shootouts. You should have swallowed that. You will use that carbohydrate. Yeah. But there may be some events or maybe some scenarios, like sometimes when we've got athletes who are doing the train low sessions of exercise, so they've got low glycogen, they're feeling pretty terrible, they still want to get through the session. I mean, there can be some advantage in being able just to mouth rinse and spit it out so that you don't interfere with the fuel story, that you're trying to keep that session being low in carbohydrate, but you're still making your brain feel a bit better so that it can get through the session as well as possible.
It's interesting you're talking about, the fact you can absorb glucose and fructose. There's different transporters and things now, because for a while there, when I was first doing carbohydrate ingestion studies, it was always, you should have glucose, don't have fructose, because it's going to go through the liver and it's going to slow things down and whatever. But then the studies started coming out saying, well, you can get both. And it's interesting, again, I think it's us kind of overthinking things, because what is the classic molecule, which is glucose and fructose? It's sugar. Yeah. So that's like what you're getting sort of naturally if you're having sugar cane, not just sugar. You're getting both. But we go and say, oh, no, you need to have glucose, not fructose.
But even going one step further back, I remember Dave Costal telling me that, when he started in sports science, the thought was that you didn't take carbohydrate in during exercise at all, because once you started putting it into fluids or consuming it, you'd retard gastric emptying, and then there was going to be this terrible problem with your hydration needs. And he told me that, that was their thinking, telling athletes either don't have carbs during exercise or keep your fluids below 2% so that it's not going to interfere with gastric emptying. And then he went over and did a sabbatical with Bengt Saltine in Scandinavia. And he'd see these cross-country skiers and they'd be drinking, what we would now think of as a gel, this really gloopy sort of syrupy carbohydrate out on their skis. And he'd say, oh, that's crazy, man. He'd say, you're not going to empty any of that and it's just going to be sitting in your stomach. And they'd said, really? No, we're pretty sure that we're getting the benefit of this. And he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. You go and do that session, drink all that syrupy carbs, and at the end of the session, I'll put a nasogastric tube down and I'll take it out of your stomach and show you where it is. And when he did that, he found that it had all been perfectly emptied. There was nothing to see, that people had adapted because they were practicing that sort of an approach. And so, he's one of the things I love about Dave is he's got so much history to talk about, but he's quite happy to say, I've been wrong and we've learned something different and now I have different ideas.
Well, I'm very glad you said that, because I've been trying to get David Costa onto this thing. I've asked him 3 times. So now I get asking other people to tell him to come on, because I think it'd be great to have him on.
He is truly one of the most quality human beings and the greatest sports scientist. He's so humble He knows so much. He's applied it all to real life sport, which I just love. And he's such a lovely guy.
What a magnificent swimmer.
Oh, absolutely.
He came to Victoria University where I was at, and I managed to get him into the pool there. And, he was doing 200 metres of butterfly, and he was like 78. I think he did have a world record in the medley or something.
Yeah, he's amazing.
All right, so back to Tour de France. So they were talking about, people were sort of sending in questions, and they were saying, Simon Gerrans yesterday said that they were having 5,000 calories during a stage. I just thought that can't be right. Maybe during it over a whole day. I mean, do you have any idea of how much are they actually having during the bout, during the
well, look,
session, and then how much during the day, and how much do they actually do? Like, do they actually maintain their weight over the whole tour? Do they lose weight? That sort of stuff.
So it used to be a bit hit and miss, and it certainly was an event where we probably led the way with having chefs and having soigneurs being able to support the riders to eat during a 6 hour or 8 hour stage. And of course, the good thing about cycling is that both you can sit up and eat, and you can peel things and eat normal food, but you're also not moving at such a pace and joggling yourself that you have the gastrointestinal problems. So there is more capacity to be able to consume things on the bike. And Wim Saris did a study back in the 1980s showing that the cyclists were consuming these very large numbers of calories over the day, as you said, but 60 to 70% of it was happening on the bike during the stage, because that was so much of the day's activity. But these days you find that most of the teams have very specific plans that change from day to day and change from rider to rider. And there are some teams that might say for the early part of the race, they're quite happy for the athlete to be in negative energy balance, to be actually losing some weight, because they've got a hill stages coming up. And they'll also probably switch to a low residue diet. So they take all the fibre out of the diet so that, again, they lose a little bit of weight just because they've got rid of some of the stuff that was in their stomach. So it's not real weight loss. It's just making the scales change because you've removed fibre from your gut. But that means that when the rider hits the hills, they might be, 1 or 2 kilos lighter. But then they'll have days, and I'm thinking of, someone like Chris Froome, where there's a big stage and they've chosen that one. That's the tactical stage where he's going to go out on his own, and he's going to, ride. And because he's on his own, he's going to be using a very high fuel mix, because he's going to be doing all the work, not getting some streamlining in the back of the peloton. And, they'll really load up the carbs for that day, both in his breakfast and during the ride itself. And when he won the Giro d'Italia, and he had that incredible stage, I think it was 24, 25, anyway, whatever the stage was, and they recorded his fuel intake, and it was just prodigious over the 6 hours, 8 hours of riding. And so there will be some times where that is actually seen. So again, people might look at that and see it and think, oh, that's what they do all the time because we're just talking about it. But you'll find that there's going to be these very different strategies, very different tactics that go from day to day, depending on what rider you are and what you need to do.
Okay, well, that makes sense. This has been great. A lot of talk about carbohydrates and things, but what about protein? You always hear people saying, oh, I go to the gym, I've got to eat, protein every meal and meat every meal and whatever. I mean, surely you're only going to put on a few grams of muscle a day. You don't need to be eating kilos, do you?
No, but protein is the new black. So it's, the thing that we all want to talk about in sport at the moment. I think the message is that most people, including most athletes, already consume enough protein in their Western eating patterns. There is a good amount of protein, but the problem is that we probably don't eat it well enough in terms of spreading it over the day. And if you think about exercise as having a legacy of probably 24 hours at least, where it's changed your body metabolism and allowing it to do something more effectively, if you can put in protein in sort of serial amounts, so maybe every 3 to 5 hours, you get a good amount of protein to continue the work that exercise session has stimulated, then you'll get a better output than somebody who's eating the same amount of protein, but having it all at night. And that's what generally the Western eating patterns are. You know, we hardly eat any protein at breakfast, or we don't eat breakfast at all. There's a little bit of lunch, and then we eat half a cow at evening. So we might eat enough protein, but being able to spread it out, having some after a session of exercise to be able to start muscle protein synthesis as effectively as possible, and then topping it up every sort of 3 to 5 hours is probably the most effective way of being able to get the best out of that session. But as you said, it's not a heap amount of protein that we're needing each day to convert into new muscle protein. So the idea that we need lots of protein is more probably repurposed as spreading the protein to where it's going to be most effective, and recognizing that, you know, quite a small amount at that time, you know, probably 20 to 25 grams of protein in a serve is going to be enough for most people to get their benefit.
So for most people, just, you know, gym junkies, just go in the gym. They're not athletes. They're not trying to, you know, compete or whatever. It's just a normal mixed diet. I mean, maybe, you know, like you said, spacing it out a bit, but it's not really something they've got to think about. What I'm getting at, I guess, is people make it so complicated when really what we need is just to have people exercise. You know, just get out there and do it. And don't worry about, oh, I can't exercise because I haven't had any protein, or, you know.
But it's good to see that everyday foods can provide that protein. And probably what we're trying to think of with people is, what can you do just to add a little bit extra protein to that breakfast? If you're only having a bagel, or, you know, something that's really just carbohydrate focused, we'll have some chocolate milk with it. And that means that you can have everyday food, you know, making a contribution to the protein thing. And that's one of the interesting things in sports nutrition, how every now and again something takes hold. And so chocolate milk's become the darling of protein in sports nutrition. You know, it's a food that most people like. You can find it in most shops. Everyone's probably about 50 metres away from a chocolate milk source at some point in the day. And so it's one of the ways in which you can get some carbs, some fluids, some electrolytes, and some protein in the amounts that you probably would find useful. And it's everyday food. So it's nice sometimes that food becomes the focus of education rather than it all being coming out of a bottle or a can in terms of protein supplements.
Yes, they don't need to be having these protein shakes every 5 minutes. And you'll see them, sometimes they will be chocolate flavoured, but they'll be, you know, an official protein shake. You've got to shake it up and have it, you know, within a millisecond of finishing your gym session and whatever. It's not really.
Yeah, and look, you know, sometimes it can be going and having a coffee after the, well, not a coffee, going and having hot chocolate after the session in the local coffee shop and hang out with friends. So you can make it part of your everyday life and social settings rather than it, you know, being this chalky stuff that you pay a lot of money for and just sort of gobble down and think, oh, that was awful.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, chocolate keeps coming up, so I think we're showing our personalities here. But another thing you see is these protein meals. You know, I was at the 7-Eleven or whatever the other day, and they just had a whole sort of refrigerated section or frozen section for these protein meals. You know, it just feels like it's too complicated. You know, just a normal mixed diet.
And look, everything, people are moving, I guess, to wanting to have convenience foods, and I'm sort of mixed minds about some of the marketing of that, because in some ways it can be a better form of what people might choose for a meal. And if you're, you know, we like people to be able to cook and to go and shop and do everything from scratch and understand the basics of nutrition practices. But, you know, there's so many times where you might have an athlete who's traveling, or you might have people who are, you know, very busy at work. And if the alternative is just takeaway and it's terrible, or just something out of the, you know, the junk machine in the corner of your office, well, it's much better to be able to have a meal that's made of real food that you're just heating up. So there's time and place for everything, but we'd like people to have the whole range of nutrition options as part of what they can do, and then they're using the more processed ones on occasions where it's actually a better choice than nothing.
Great. All right. Well, I think we've covered quite a lot. Is there any other sort of mythy sort of things going around? So, you know, fads, I guess. the thing I hear a bit, again, last night, they were talking about, the athletes are going to have water and then they're going to have the electrolyte drinks and things like that. And it's like quite often people tend to think that a sports drink, for example, is an electrolyte drink. And I always think, well, hang on, the main thing is you're getting the carbohydrate. I remember a study we did with Mark Hargraves.
Well, there are.
A study we did with Mark Hargraves and David Kostel. We actually looked at how much electrolytes are actually in the drinks, and they're very small compared to, your blood is very salty. And the amount of salt they actually put in the drinks is small. Is it really making much of a contribution, the electrolyte content of these sports drinks?
Well, there's actually special sports drinks, often branded as the endurance drinks, that have a higher salt content. And that's to take into account that there are salty sweaters. There are some people who do marathons and triathlons, Ironman races, and they're losing quite a bit of sodium in the sweat. And so for them, replacing more sodium can be useful. But it's probably over exaggerated in the diets of most people, especially when most of us are consuming too much salt outside exercise.
Exactly right. I mean, I remember, I think it was Susan Barr did a study, 6 hours of exercise, and whether you drank water or no fluid or fluid containing that small amount of sodium, it actually made no difference. The main thing was that the sodium goes up during the exercise. To me, it didn't make sense. I mean, why you would want to be having a high electrolyte drink when, if anything, your sodium goes up during exercise, you're just going to put it up more.
Well, when you're replacing fluid only and you're not replacing the electrolytes, those salty sweaters can get that dilution effect, but it's a rare thing. I think, the availability of the endurance drinks with the higher sodium content has a place, but it is a very specialised need. But you're right, it's really understanding about you, your event, and what you need.
The average person going in there and buying those drinks is just, it's not needed. It's not like I'm a high sweater and I'm about to do an Iron Person event. They're just buying a drink.
Marketing makes us all feel like we need things we don't. I've just bought myself a $400 pair of those super shoes to see if I can help my next marathon. And, I probably don't have the caliber that really deserves it, but it makes me feel excited that I'm going to go out and I'm going to train in it, and I've got something special to look forward to when I get to that next race.
Fantastic. All right. So thank you very much for that. It's been a great chat. Is there anything else you think we should? I don't know. No,
I think we've had a lovely chat. We've had some memory digging to remember some of the things we've done in our past, and we've talked about some other great people who've contributed to our lives in the science.
Great. All right. Well, thanks a lot. Is it okay if people reach out to you maybe on Twitter, or if they have any questions?
Yes, I'm on Twitter. I've got a love-hate relationship with Twitter, but hopefully contribute a little bit there. And also, you can go to PubMed and look up our publications. We try these days to make them open access, so they're freely available to everybody that would like to read about our science.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks again. See you.
Great. Bye.